to be honest, I don't know what context you feel you have for this, but basically, as you may know, I hosted Hamza on my podcast.
Yep.
Well, we recorded with him actually back in July, so it was like 3 months ago, and
Hmm.
then we published a couple of episodes like last maybe a month ago or something, and
Okay.
and then I actually met him for a private kind of follow-up chat. We just ended up spending 3 4 hours together talking about various things, and somewhere in the middle of that, he said. Um, Oh, you really need to speak to Fahad. Yeah. And he said that
I
you were
wonder what context.
yeah. Well, um, I think partly. So he mentioned that your current work. Are you in the middle of a PhD or something?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
So, and is that on like aesthetics and beauty?
Yeah, it's on beauty. Yeah.
Right,
So
right, right. Nice. Yeah. So I think he mentioned it in the context of that work that you're doing, and
I see.
probably from recollection, because it was quite a late night, and I can't quite
Right.
remember all of it. But it was perhaps related to a concern that I generally share on this, or try to kind of discuss in my conversations, and I was sharing with him
Okay.
around uh, essentially fundamentally around like our ability to understand and then convey faith as a universal value proposition, essentially.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
whereas a lot of our kind of perhaps theological, scholarly community efforts and discourse are very
Yeah.
much kind of with very much defensive, apologetic, and
Sure.
kind of identity politics sort of driven and
Sure. Sure.
self-interested ultimately. And
Yeah.
I feel one of my bugbears for a long time has been that we just don't seem to have the language, sometimes frankly the ideas,
Sure.
to just communicate what all of this means, bilisan al-qawm, right, in a relatable way, just to
Yeah.
people, and actually just to we we still see ourselves as outsiders of a mainstream of these countries that we're living in,
Sure.
and
Sure.
actually, like, I don't know, like I sometimes I kind of wonder whether I'm going crazy or what's going on, because I feel
Right.
like that isn't, I still feel it's not significantly shifting. And actually every time we have one of these major shocks, Palestine obviously currently, and all of these other various things that have been taking place for God knows how long now, most of our
Sure.
lifetimes, it
Yeah.
just the even the bigger tragedy of those things is the way it just sets us back mentally, in my view.
Okay. All right.
In terms of like, because it makes us even more defensive and even more in retreat, and we just aren't, I think, sometimes maybe planting the seeds sufficiently for that longer term engagement, that longer term work, and
Okay.
maintaining a kind of universal prophetic concern, essentially.
Sure. So
Anyway.
would you say that for a long time the Muslim communities in the West, I know that's a really big generalization, but
mm,
have been more reactive than proactive,
Essentially, yeah.
essentially, right? Because I just finished a meeting with someone just before this call, and that's one of the things that we were talking about is that there's no sort of um, let's say long-term strategy, if that makes sense, right? With a lot of Muslim communities, because obviously a lot of them are when you look at it in comparison to other communities, at least here in the US, um, other communities have had a longer history, and so we're just kind of getting our bearings together and trying to figure out where do we go, whether we're talking about politically, whether we're talking about, I mean, from my vantage point, it would be from the outreach or dawah side, right? And like you mentioned, a lot of times when people hear the word dawah, they kind of quarantine that understanding to it's going to be a debate, or it's going to be, how do you overcome your interlocutor and completely dominate them intellectually, which is fine in certain contexts. But like you mentioned, kind of that real I mean, you mentioned like a universal type message, but I would say just a human message, right? That this is
Yeah,
something that's going to be
exactly.
tapping into a person's entire life and experiences and backgrounds. And when we don't have that appreciation and we look at someone as the other or someone that's going to come at us and we take a defensive position, um, it can be problematic. It can be challenging in the long term.
Yeah,
Um,
no,
so
absolutely. Absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly. So that's the thing. Actually, so I would say my view on it is that actually we have increasingly, I think, got longer term strategies for our community.
right.
But it's just that's just an elongation of that self-centeredness out into the future.
Sure,
But I think
sure.
what we don't have is the longer term vision for society,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Which
All
then
right.
positions us again not as like it's almost then your and I know this comes across in a strange way for some people or maybe many people, but it's almost like your loyalty to the flourishing of faith in society trumps your loyalty to this Muslim community essentially, right?
Okay.
And actually, if you're loyal to the project of faith flourishing in society for everybody, and you're not privileging, your sort of Muslim versus over non-Muslim as they happen to you happen or a person happens to sort of divide them up right now, um,
Sure.
you will take care of the internal concerns. But if you only focus on the internal concerns as your prime
Right.
thing, then
Yeah.
I think you'll lose both games almost.
So let me ask you, do you think it's just we do that because it's just more comfortable? Because
Yeah, I think more comfortable. I think for the reasons I mentioned. I think that um, when you're on the receiving end of threats and shocks and everything else, you become more
sure,
defensive,
sure.
whatever. Um,
Right.
one of my sort of contrarian positions that I push out there sometimes is that I wonder whether even the usage of the transliterated terms Islam and
Mhm.
Muslim in the way that we use them is even valid or helpful. In fact.
Okay. All
Because
right.
interestingly, what happens off the back of that is that you get a whole field of terminology, such as non-Muslim, such as Islamic, the adjective, such as
Okay.
Islam says such and such, or in Islam, ABC, right?
Sure.
But which actually, when you look at the sources that we refer to, those don't quite all of a sudden they don't quite correlate. You know,
Okay.
there is no there's a difference between when we say even I was thinking about this in relation to something I saw today when we talk about converts and reverts, right?
Sure.
So
Yeah.
this is
It's perennial
but
debate.
yeah, but no, but I'm not saying even the choice between the two. I'm just saying use the
Just
usage
the
of
any
them.
the usage of them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because again, do I find so when you is there a, I mean even just stepping back a second, just uh the adjective Islami
Yep.
that is not
Sure.
right that we use that in a way which you can't directly, at least I can understand by inference or whatever, you can't directly infer from or sorry, you can't directly extract from
Yeah.
from revelation for any prophetic saying anyhow.
Okay.
But like so I think it's yeah, so I think it's partly the shocks. I think it's how we have conceived ourselves. We've got stuck in the identity politics, and I think in a way it's partly
Yeah.
to do with this thing where again subconsciously or otherwise it's like the lines are drawn, right?
hmm
There are Muslims, there are
Sure.
non-Muslims, and
Right.
okay, yes, like you said, there's this compartmentalized thing called dawah. We'll do a bit of engagement and maybe try and get people along. But it's
Sure.
almost like to your earlier point, I think, and I think I've been really like that's something that's kind of landed for me, where I feel I've internalized more and more in recent months and maybe a year or two is that, yeah, like, I think we've just stopped seeing people as people, and we do the same otherization that we complain of that happening to us essentially, and it's this weird vicious circle into nowhere, I think.
So I'll share something personal with you, where I kind of had that realization like years ago. I was we were living in a certain neighborhood. I'm in Texas, by the way.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
And we were living in a certain part of Houston city in Texas here. Um, and I remember one of my when my children were little, my son came and he's like, "Hey, Bob, I want to go outside and play." Right. And I said, "Okay, but who's watching you? You know?" And he said, "Well, the neighbor's watching us." So I opened the door and I see this white guy just sitting there, right? And immediately I was like, "Nah, I don't know about that," right?
Mm,
And my wife was like, "Well, I mean, if he's watching them," I was like, "Well, I don't like I've never met him, right? He's a white dude. I mean, for all we know, he could be a pedophile." Just
mm.
kind of like because I don't know if it was because I was watching a crime show before that or whatever the deal was, but that sort of stereotype,
Mm,
and I just stopped myself. I said, SubhanAllah, like this is like I'm immediately putting him in this box of like a pedophile because most Caucasians are pedophile or most pedophiles are Caucasian, and so
mm,
therefore he must be like that. I'm like, that's how we're on the receiving end of that a lot of
mm,
times, right? Like, oh, he must be a terrorist. So
mm,
if I'm doing the same thing, it's just I had to catch myself for a second
mm,
and
mm,
say, hold on a second. Yeah, I should just go over there and meet him. Because at the end of the day, he's a human being, right? And he has, from my vantage point, he has a right to Islam like everyone else has a right to Islam.
mm,
Your backdrop doesn't elevate you in terms of your right to truth, right? To put it very simply. But then again, like I said, it does happen. You're right. Because then you see the other as just other. And we talk a lot about otherization. I was having this conversation yesterday with someone, how otherization actually takes place, and otherization, there's a number of steps. I think Dr. Osman Latif has written a beautiful book on this. But when you otherize someone, you have to dehumanize them at the end of the day. And then you make them an object of something else, right? Like, okay, so they're the object of dawah, and therefore now we're going to make dawah to them as this other, as opposed to saying it's a human being, and this human being has a nafs, has a qalb, has a fitra, has all of these things,
Exactly.
and is affected by many of the things that we're affected by. And I do, and I will say with everything that's happened in Gaza, I think we've seen that humanity come about in ways that we could not have imagined, right? So, right, after October 7th, 2 years ago, like the months and following that, you had this big uptick in shahadas, like in the masajid, in at least in the US.
Mm.
Like it was like almost every Jummah khutbah, everything. It was like you were having, and you'd ask people like, so why, like, did Muslims come out and speak to you? Was it your neighbor? They said, no, man, we would watch these images and we would see the people of Gaza, and we could not reconcile how it is that they would have such resilience. And we wanted to know, what is the source of that resilience? I mean, they, like, for instance, they would say, like, I have lots of issues in my life, right? I've just went through a divorce. I get a flat tire. I have problems with my kids. Typical issues that everyone has. Yet I don't have that kind of resilience. Like, I get impatient, and these people have lost life and limb and family, and yet they hold their head up high. I wanted to know what was the source of that. And when I investigated that, it was Islam, you know? Um, so again, kind of saying like, okay, well, these are problems that human beings share. And a lot of times when we are, let's say, making dawah to them, we're not making dawah to a human being. We're making dawah to a rational robot that, input, propositional logical argument one, and output is shahada. That's the expectation. And yet, that humanity, we saw an uptick in that because they were able to see the resilience of the people in Gaza, and they wanted to have that tranquility, that ability to take on whatever sort of challenges that life can throw at you because there's a higher purpose and all of that. Um, so yeah, so I would say that that othering and sometimes in a sense it is a type of dehumanization
Mm.
that that we engage with. We kind of we assume certain things about the other, and then we try to address those assumptions as opposed to addressing what is actually going on. That's
Yeah.
why a lot of times we'll say that, when you are serving as an intellectual ambassador to Islam, right? Uh, your job isn't to convince and to talk all the time. The majority of your time you should be spent listening, right? Because the person's cultural backdrop, their issues, their problems, there's a lot that you're going to have in common before you get to, if you're talking like I live in Texas, the Bible Belt, whatever, big Christian population. Most people think, okay, when you get to a Christian, like if I asked you, how would you address a Christian? Like what areas do you want to talk about with a Christian? Like as a da'iyah, what would you say? What would be the first thing that comes, or what would you assume that most du'at would say? Christian? Okay.
Oh, right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think
What do
my
you think it would
response,
be?
yeah, my personal response would be different. If you're asking me what I think most people would do, then
Most people. I'm not saying you personally, but
it's
most
obviously Jesus and with the statement of
Jesus, the
Jesus, Son of
Trinity,
God,
and
Trinity. Exactly. Yeah.
of course.
Whereas for me, I'll be like, yeah, how's it going, mate?
Right, right. I mean, but even past the let's say the niceties that you'd start off with
Yeah, yeah.
introduction. In the back, in the back of a person's mind, they'd be like, okay, so they're Christian, so I need to talk to them about Jesus. Like I have to talk to them about the Trinity, and I have to talk to them about how the Trinity is dumb. It doesn't make any sense. Like that's where you're essentially going, and yet by having that in the backdrop, like you kind of miss out the fact that who is the person you're talking to, right?
Mm.
Sometimes I'll mention, there was some time ago I was invited to, I think it was Oklahoma. Yeah, it was Oklahoma. There was a masjid there, And I just finished the khutbah, and the imam said, "Look, man, you're into this dawah stuff, right?" So I was like, "Yeah." He's like, "There's a lady in my office. Can you talk to her?" So I was like, "Sure, I don't mind. She's a non-Muslim lady." So when I approach her, the first thing she says is, uh, "Aren't you don't doesn't your religion or didn't your prophet slaughter 700 Jews?" Like no hi, no hello, no like how are you doing? And she's in the masjid, right? And she's in the imam's office.
Pretty brave.
First thing right off the very blunt, right?
Mm.
Um, and so, one reaction would be like, well, how dare she? I mean, this is my Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, and and so, and sometimes when we teach classes and stuff, I'll give this as an example to students. Like, what would you tell her? Like, how would you approach her? What would you do? you know? And so a lot of students would be like, well, I would ask her, like, what's her sources? Where did you get that information? How do you know that's true? I said, okay. And then I say, look, I'll tell you what I did, and you can judge for yourself. Uh, I said to her, how's it going? Why don't we step inside? Let me get you some coffee. Right? Like, you know, which I appreciate that that's difficult because it's as if this person has just insulted the Prophet ﷺ, in a sense, right? And for you to kind of have hilm, have that kind of to be able to withhold is really difficult. But sometimes we forget that, when we look at like the word jahiliya, for instance, most people think that the opposite of jahl is ilm, right? It's knowledge, but it's also hilm. It's
Yeah.
also forbearance.
Mm.
You need both, right? So what did the Prophet bring? What did Islam bring? It didn't just bring knowledge. It brought your ability to like, to have forbearance, right? Because the Arabs at that time, the smallest thing would set them off. They go to war, generations. What is Islam bringing? It's not only bringing them guidance in the form of knowledge, it's bringing them guidance in the form of how to not jump the gun, right? And to kind of, have withhold yourself and be able to kind of see past, people's predispositions and things like that. So anyway, so I invited her in and I told her, I said, like, let's have some coffee. Why don't you sit down? Tell me a little bit about yourself. Like, look, I appreciate, you might have read that somewhere, whatever it might be. And we can get to that, but just tell me a little about yourself. I mean, are you like, what's your backdrop? So she said, I'm Christian. Yeah. And sometimes with the students, I'll ask them, okay, what should I say next? And they would be like, well, I'd go right to Jesus, right? Like, and some of the students who are a little more less combative would say, we believe in Jesus too. Okay.
Mm.
And I said, okay, all right, that's one approach. And other students would be like, well, I'd go right to the Trinity. I'd talk about that, how that makes no sense. I said, okay, I'll tell you what I did. So, I asked her about her family. I asked her about her backdrop. I said, what church do you go to? I have a background in studying Christian denominations as well, especially specifically how they operate in the U.S. Like there's a difference between a Baptist and there's a difference between a Calvinist and there's different, these are different groups that have different theological positions. Having an understanding of that, I think, is important because then you're able to, again, humanize the person, right? Like the person who understands that, for instance, like Baptists believe that to baptize a baby is wrong, right? Right? Why? Even though they're called Baptists, which seems strange, because they say that no, a person should be an adult and choose to follow Jesus. So therefore, an adult baptism is what's required. Infant baptism is completely meaningless, right? Anyways, that's just a fine theological point with Baptists, whatever it might be. But point being, like, what is the person's background? So I got her background, and then I asked her. I said, "Look, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you believe in something called the original sin." She said, "Yes." I said, "Okay." Like, I want to just kind of tell you about what we believe, right? So we also have the story of Adam and Eve in the Quran. It's just a little bit different. And so I went into the story of Adam alayhi salam, and I kind of highlighted the idea that when he sinned, he slipped, and when he slipped, فَتَلَقَّى آدَمُ مِنْ رَبِّهِ كَلِمَاتٍ, right? That Allah approached him with words so that he could ask for forgiveness, right? And God forgave him. And so we don't, as Muslims, we don't really have a belief in original sin. We have a belief in original goodness, which is called the fitrah. And so my assumption about human beings including you, as I was speaking to her, is that every human being, their base state is a state of goodness, of innocence and purity. And I'm like, that's why when you see a newborn baby, you don't look at that baby and say, look at that sinful little rat, right? You look at that child and say, look at that innocent, innocent being, right? So this concept of the fitra, even like when you look at legal systems, for instance, trans-historically, the common law, U.S. constitutional law, there's always innocence, innocence before guilt, right? And you have to prove your guilt. Similarly, we say that we're even innocent of sin, and that has to be proven later on, right? So I mentioned this to her, and I said, and so my assumption about you as a person is that at your core, you're good, and that's how God created you, right? Um, and again, I said, correct me if I'm wrong, and that kind of runs against the assumption that every human being is evil, right? Or they're born in a state of evil or born in a state of sin. And that's not something that we recognize. And I don't recognize that in you. Anyways, long story short, uh, this conversation ended up with her bawling, crying, and she took her shahada. Alhamdulillah.
Uh,
And I was on the plane on the way back home. I live in Texas, like I said, and this is Oklahoma, a different state. And it struck me that I never answered her first question.
yeah, I was just going to ask whether
Right? Like, what happened with
that came
that?
up. Mm,
But the thing is now that let's say she goes back to the Sita, she reads that story, now she has a different set of lenses by which she's going to approach it.
mm.
Now it's like, hold on a second. Yeah, now I'm going to see, okay, the context. But me getting into an argument with her about proving this one point about the Prophet ﷺ, frankly, I don't know if it would have gone anywhere, right? Because she's already come in with her mind made up. And the other thing that you'll notice is that I didn't really speak about the Trinity or Jesus. Like, I kind of got there, but I got there not by attacking the Trinity, not by saying, okay, well, that there's no sacrifice, whatever it is. I got there by saying, look, the reason why you need a sacrifice is because there's a concept of original sin. If there's no concept of original sin, there's no point in a sacrifice.
Yeah, sure.
It's gone then. You don't need it. And
No.
so now when someone says, okay, wala qatuluhu wala salabuhu, right, that he wasn't killed, he wasn't crucified, it actually makes more sense from this vantage point of something that's human, something that's natural, something that's an assumption that in her mind initially may have been like, well, Muslims have this assumption that human beings are born in a state of goodness and their assumption about human beings is good. That sort of all of that backdrop now kind of leads to, all right, well, there's no point in Jesus coming and dying for his sins and so on and so forth. So now when I had that conversation, it naturally flowed. It was very natural to say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. It was interesting that it was either her or someone else I had spoken to, which said that, I've always had this question about children, though. Like, how do we assume children are evil?
Yeah.
And she was just, it was an honest moment for her.
Mm.
Um, but going back to your point, I think we were talking about kind of humanizing people. Um, you have to humanize, and a lot of times that can be challenging because they will say things that are going to rattle you and that may be deeply offensive to you. But if you're truly interested in this person and you're truly interested in goodness for this person, you have to kind of look beyond that. And
Of
that's
course. I mean,
tough.
I mean, so many of the powerful verses that illustrate the prophetic character
Yeah,
essentially speak to that, right? Uh,
exactly.
so
Exactly. And
do
we,
you,
we sometimes look at that in abstraction,
yeah,
and
but
we
it's
say
very
like,
real.
okay,
Yeah.
there was I think it was what Maulana Maududi, right, who said that if you really want to understand the Quran, you have to understand it from the vantage point of an activist,
Oh yeah.
right?
But no,
And
I often say, look, it's fundamentally, it's a message that empowers a mission. It's essentially a leadership
100%.
manual,
Yeah,
right? Basically.
100%.
Yeah.
100%. And so, and that's so true because unless you're in that, I don't want to say field, but that you're doing these things where you're interested you're interested in the wellness of a person. You're interested in that person, being in a state of goodness, being, entering paradise essentially. If you're truly interested in that, then your mission is kind of central from a certain vantage point. And how the Quran now speaks to you is very different. And I remember there was we always read stories of the prophets and then prophets being threatened by their life. I don't think most people have not been, at least most people in the West have not been threatened when they're making dawah. Maybe in the UK it's a bit different. I don't know. Maybe you guys probably have, but
No,
here in the States you don't get someone coming up and threatening your life. And there was one occasion we were making, we had a stall that we had set up in New York, New York City. It was outside of a place called Union Station, and it was on Halloween, which was even more crazy because New York is crazy in and of itself. Like people are just, it's a very interesting phenomenon when you go there, and now you add to that Halloween, which people are dressed up and and we for some reason or other decided, you know what, today would be a great day to go out and make some street dawah. But I remember we had I was speaking with someone, this guy. He was very I was trying to give him a Quran. I said he was Latino, and I said to him, I said, look, why don't you take this Quran? It'd be good. And he was being very obstinate, like I don't need this. I don't need God. And what's God ever done for me? And what am I going to get out of reading this book? Like, he wouldn't even take it. And while I was talking to him, this guy shows up behind me, large Caucasian guy, like broad, muscular, super, like really tall, you know, definitely like 6'5" plus, whatever, tattoos and everything. And he shows up and he yells out behind me, goes, "Hey!" And I turn around, he goes, "You Muslims here are doing all this stuff. And I served in Iraq and I killed a bunch of you there. And I'm thinking it's a good idea if I kill a few more of you now.
oh
I'm
wow,
gonna go back to my truck and grab my shotgun."
oh yeah,
Oh, now I'm like, oh no, right? So, but what occurred to me at that moment was like, okay, I'm gonna die. And so you think I'm gonna be really brave and all that stuff goes out the window. Like there's no, like like you're not. You think you're gonna be brave. There's no, I was scared. Um, Thankfully enough, the NYPD showed up. They arrested him, took him away. Because he was obviously threatening violence and stuff. But I was actually scared for my life at this point. And now when I would come to like ayat of the Quran where prophets are threatened, I mean, I'm not obviously equating, myself to them, but
sure, sure.
you get a
Yeah, but
better
you
sense
get
of
it,
it.
yeah, exactly, yeah,
You get a better sense of like what they went through and what they felt like.
yeah, yeah.
On a side note, the Latino guy that I was talking to, he was totally shaken up. So he's like, "Hey, you know that Quran you guys were talking? I'll take a copy."
He found God pretty quick after that
He
one.
turned around real quick and he's like, "I'll take a copy of that Quran." So,
Interesting.
but yeah, so ayat of the Quran, when you're in, when you have that, when you're mission centric, they actually make a lot more sense
Yeah,
than
100%.
just being in some sort of abstraction where you're just going to work, coming home, and that's it. So,
Yeah, no, no doubt, no doubt. Um, yeah, I'm really interested to just to understand from you how you got into this whole beauty
mm,
exploration. Sounds very modern. And interestingly, you don't, it's not I would say in academic, scholarly, preacher, teacher type. So
yeah,
the word in English actually, I would say if you were to if do one of those word clouds, if you just say like what are the typical words, I probably you wouldn't see it on the thing, right? Or it would be there perhaps, but very small. So it's
right.
really I was really just interested about the fact that you can taking this on, and especially in the context of the fact that from a what's often talked about is the true, the good, and the beautiful,
Yeah,
right? But that sort of that trinity is kind of is one that uh, perhaps many within the faith aren't familiar with as a kind of that three-way conception of okay,
sure.
what is there to be aspired to and what's bound up with the notion of the existence of God, etc. So anyway, just maybe just say how did you get into this and what are you actually what questions are you addressing?
Yeah, so there was a couple of things. I don't know if there was kind of one main impetus that said, okay, now I'm going to start studying about beauty, but there's a few things like
Well, you could say I looked in the mirror one day and I thought
it was interesting because I think the first time I did a talk on this and I produced the slides, I sent it to Hamza. And he said, you're doing this talk on beauty. These slides are ugly, man. Like it's such a contradiction. I was like, you know what? He's right. I should probably make them a little more presentable.
Mm.
But like I said, so there wasn't just one kind of impetus. Well, I had looked into, for instance, the concept. Like, there was this narration about the Prophet ﷺ, forbidding mafdam, which is a certain red color, right? It's a type of deep crimson red. And I thought it was interesting. Like, generally,
In men's clothing.
in men's clothing, right? And so And there's a narration that he forbade it. And then you get into the details about what was forbidden, how exactly you wear it. Is it if it is disrupted by another color, it's okay because he wore a hulla, which is a Yemeni garment, and so on. It got me thinking about the impact of the visual impact of color. Like when you are making dawah, for instance, when are you like, does color impact how you perceive the other person? Does it have an impact on your emotions, right? Does it have a cognitive impact? Like, will it block certain, like if you're trying to present the truth, you want the person to be, cognitively free, or like, that there's no blockage, there's no impediment. So it got me thinking, and I started looking into color theory. There's this interesting book that was written maybe 10 years ago by Adam Adler called Drunk Tank Pink.
Okay.
And what Drunk Tank Pink refers to, so in the U.S. Navy, I think it was maybe the naval base in Seattle, if I'm not mistaken. They would have a problem with sailors coming back and coming back to the base and kind of getting drunk and then starting a ruckus, right? Like going to the bars, getting into fights.
Mm.
And so what they would do to these sailors, they would take them and throw them in a type of prison, like a type of jail cell. And so there was some research that had come out in terms of color theory that said that a certain type of pink, that amoxicillin pink, which is that like the kind that you get for antibiotics, where, I don't know if you've ever. So
Yeah.
that particular pink actually has a calming effect.
Yeah, I heard something
When,
like that. Yeah. Yeah.
right.
Mm.
And so what they started to do is they started to paint these cell block, these prisons pink. These prisons are called drunk tanks because they would throw them drunk sailors in there. And they found that there was a noticeable difference, that they would just immediately calm down. And so drunk tank pink became the name of these cells. And so from there, they started studying a lot of elements within color theory. Like, okay, if pink does this, and interestingly, there were other case studies where you had American football teams on the collegiate level, where they would paint their opponents' locker rooms pink, so that on the field they would just be
Uh,
docile. And so that became banned. Like the governing body said you're not allowed to do that. If you're going to paint their locker rooms pink, you got to paint your locker rooms pink, or just get away with it, or
mm.
just do away with it. Um, so this got me started thinking about color theory, how there's been research done with how this has an effect on cognition. So they had tested people that, for instance, that had before they would start a certain cognitive test, they would have the booklet be totally red in color, and the pen you would use be red ink. And then they had one that had blue in color, and they had blue ink, and they did. So it turned out that red actually caused a type of cognitive degeneration. Like you couldn't answer certain numerical puzzles and other sort of literary puzzles and things like that. It was just a significant drop. So that, and I started thinking, going back to the hadith, where I wonder, and Allah knows best, right, what the wisdom is behind this, but I wonder if the fact that if you're wearing all red, that perhaps it has an effect on the person's cognition. They also showed that it had an effect on the person's emotions. So you're in a higher emotive state, and your cognition is lower, right? Based on the reason. So I started, so
And maybe links to the idea of maybe links to the idea of jahiliyyah as the opposite, and jahil as the opposite of hilm as
he's
well,
up, right?
and red and
Exactly.
anger and everything. Yeah.
Exactly, because you want someone in a calm state, and you want someone to be able to think clearly, right? And think beyond kind of just trying to support their own ego or whatever it might be. And so that's kind of where it started.
Very interesting. Yeah.
I then, and I'd done some work in that area, and then I decided to think, and the other area that I started to look at was we would sometimes train some of our du'at in some of the arguments against atheism. Okay. So for instance, there's argument from dependency or contingency. But I started to realize that, this particular argument, it actually is not effective at all. Like I would say I've maybe used it in the 20 years I've been in this space, or like I've used it with success once. And we teach it all the time. And I was
I love that. I love that. I can just imagine you got the bar chart, and then it's like, at
just
the
what?
bottom, type of argument, contingency one.
It's like,
Hilarious.
and it kind of, I came to this realization. I'm like, look, it's a great argument, and I like it. It's intellectually stimulating. Great. So theoretically, people should hear this argument. Yes, I believe in God. Absolutely. There's no option. But, when it comes down to it, because you're not really speaking about the person's like interaction with the divine. It's just this abstract concept of a being, right? That just logically has to be there,
Yeah,
right? But then
it doesn't move the soul, basically.
it doesn't move the soul. It's very cold. It's very cerebral. It's
Mm.
very, it's just based on, a kind of, again, kind of propositional logic, right? A, B, therefore C. At the end, like I said, I used it successfully once, and that was, just a person that I knew, and they were impressed by the argument. That was that. And a few years later, I'd read a statement. I believe it was Ibn Taymiyyah said it, if I'm not mistaken, where he said that these rational arguments, these are um, these are medicine for the sick, but not nutrition for the masses.
Mm. Yeah,
You
nice.
know,
Mm.
and I started to think about, well, what are some other ways outside of just logical arguments that people are attracted to Islam? And one of those ways has a lot to do with the environment that they're in. And so I started looking at certain other studies that were done. So I don't know if you've seen the that it's called Briggs or Lyre-Briggs study. It's that one kind of line that looks like an arrow,
Okay.
and then you're supposed to basically one of the lines looks like kind of an arrow, and the other one has the points going up, and the line in the middle, you're supposed to say, all right, when you look at them, it's almost like an
Oh,
optical illusion where one
yeah,
is
yeah, yeah,
larger than the other.
yeah, yeah. But they're the same. Yeah.
Right, but they're the same.
Mm.
And there were some studies done, and initially when the studies were done, they were done in the 1960s.
Mm-hmm.
And the people that partook in these studies were what are called weird, right? Western educated, industrialized, rational, democratic, whatever that acronym stands for.
Uh-huh.
So when they took this study, and 80 to 90% would see that would observe the line to be of different lengths. When they took this study and they decided, let's take it outside of the Western context. So they took it to, I believe, two African villages. I think it was the Buku tribe and the Bidi tribe. I think there's two different tribes they took it to. They didn't see the optical illusion. Like nobody saw it. Like they didn't. And so they started looking into, well, what is the possible reasoning why they don't see the optical illusion? And they found out that when you look at their living spaces, they are much more natural in the sense that there's a lot more round lines that emulate trees and just the natural world. Whereas in the Western world, our living spaces, our working spaces are very utilitarian. They're very, angular. And so because you exist in a space that's very angular, it has an impact on your depth perception, which is why you see the optical illusion. Which to me, I was like, wow, that's interesting, is that your
Fascinating.
ability to see truth in a sense is impacted by what you're surrounded with, right? And
100%.
people that exist in the natural world, they're able to see things, literally see things, right, by way of your kind of ocular senses in a way that's different than how we see it in the West.
But I think then relates to as you said, like the inner perception and why somebody who might be then in a heavily urbanized environment,
Yeah,
you put them into nature, they may uh or maybe it has that healing
it
but maybe
does.
not has a healing effect, but maybe not the nutritious effect fully because you kind of like your ability to kind of perceive fully
Yep.
is
Yep.
affected by your background. That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And then so I started to look into these things, and then I started looking at the concept of beauty itself. Like
Mm.
once you start studying, so there's another area that I was really interested in that was what is sometimes known as theological anthropology, what I've termed as pneumatology. Now, just to kind of give some backdrop to this, so
Mm.
when we say anthropology, we're talking about the study of human beings. The academic study is generally characterized by studying cultures, but when people talk about theological anthropology, it's talking about what exactly is the human being, like what is their ontological construction, in other words,
Yeah.
so obviously we have material matter, but we also have a soul. We have from the Islamic vantage point, we have a ruh, and etc. Um, so when I started to look at this and started to say, okay, hold on a second, you have the human being. And the reason I called it pneumatology is because pneuma refers to spirit or soul,
Mm.
specifically spirit, and the ruh in the Islamic tradition has kind of a centrality. And so I thought a better term in English would be pneumatology as opposed to theological anthropology. But anyways, that's part of my dissertation. I'm going to go on a tangent here. Um, so I started to look at, okay, if we have a model of who truly, like the ontological reality of a human being, or at least an understanding of that, you know, how do rational arguments compare to the natural or perception and exposure to the natural world? Because when you go to the Quran, you constantly see that Allah's pointing you towards ayat, right? And he's like, you're not going to find discursive reasoning in the Quran, right? They're not like, okay, argument A, B, therefore C. You're going to see, do they not reflect upon, that, and then you have to ask, well, why does Allah use ayat and not arguments in the sense that we're used to? And there's a reason for that, right? Because human beings have a certain construct. They're not just rational robots. They actually have an entire reality. So because I was interested in that space, I wanted to see how does beauty, and specifically natural beauty, impact the human being, right? Like, what is the relationship there? And does that have an impact on our, obviously, our emotional state? That's, I think you don't really need a dissertation to know that, but also our cognitive state. Does it have an impact on our dawah? Like when we're calling people to Islam, is the space that you're in, is that important? That took me down a certain rabbit's hole, which, again, we can talk about if you want. But that's kind of what led me to say, okay, I want to really study beauty. The other aspect was this idea of, beauty is subjective, which I thought was interesting because when you look at it, the field of aesthetics itself, you don't actually have a separate, distinct field in the pre-modern Islamic world related to aesthetics. Like beauty is spoken about, but it's always in relation to something else. So, if you look at the word Jamal or the word, Hassan, it not only has like a concept of beauty that you perceive, but it also has kind of a moral component to it. Like they're interlinked. You don't separate them in the
Yeah.
Islamic framework.
Mm.
Whereas when aesthetics comes to the scene, much later in the modern world in Europe, this is now a field where they talk about specifically how does a certain type of architecture or a painting or something like that. We're going to study that, in abstraction almost. Whereas you don't see that in the pre-modern Islamic world. So the understanding of beauty is very different. I think aesthetics is I don't know if you could say there's an Islamic aesthetics per se, because I don't think there was no sort of in the pre-modern world there was not studied as a separate field.
Well, there is now, Fahad.
But so I don't even know if I would still be comfortable calling it Islamic aesthetics,
Okay, sure.
because aesthetics has certain let's say philosophical presuppositions that are very Western,
I
you know.
see.
So I
Mm.
don't even know if I would be comfortable saying yes. Let's talk about Islamic, even though people, they do that, like in places in the Middle East and Egypt, they
Mm.
they study Islamic aesthetics. So it has become a type of field, but it is informed by how the West studies aesthetics, right? Which I think is a bit of a faux pas, right?
But
And
within that Western tradition, don't you have both, like, sort of, let's say, faith-based or God-centered type of aesthetic
you
thought
do, you
and contributions, as
absolutely
well as like the modernist, postmodernist type stuff as well?
100%. And that's another interesting aspect is that how much of um, that faith-based paradigm are we affected by, right? So I'll do another kind of thought experiment when I'm teaching a section, one of the courses we do, and I'll ask them, I say, look, I'm going to say a word, and I want you to tell me what's the first thing that comes to your mind. All right? So I'll do it with you if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure.
Just tell me the first thing that comes to your mind.
All right.
You
My
ready for the word?
psychoanalysis my, happens now.
So here's the word. And you might surprise me, by the way. So, because,
No, well, probably not. Go
like
on.
a free thinker and all, you got this.
No.
All right. So here's the word. The word is art, A-R-T. What's the first thing that comes to your mind before you have a chance to think?
The first word that came to my mind was beauty.
You came beauty. Okay.
Yeah.
Most people, and maybe because we're speaking about beauty right
Perhaps,
now,
yeah.
most people would tell me things like Rembrandt,
Oh,
Van
really? Oh,
Gogh,
interesting.
movies,
And that.
paintings. etc. And this is and some people would say, okay, yeah, beauty, okay, maybe, but a lot of that would just be, paintings and art and well, not art's the word, but
Sure.
in other words, it was almost like the majority of people relegated their understanding of art to visual perception.
Right.
Like it was focused on the visual. And I'll tell people, I say, notice either none of you or maybe one or two of you mention things like poetry, like that which is attached to the auditory sensation. And I said, if you really think about why that's true, because our paradigm has an impact on us. So when you're now thinking about art, you're thinking about it from a kind of a Eurocentric, Western-centric vantage point, where their backdrop was such that when they wanted to understand the divine, the word became flesh, and therefore their understanding of the divine was done through things like icons, stained glass, art, statues, etc., things like that. Whereas if you go to the pre-modern Islamic world, how do we connect with the divine? It is by way of the Quran. So for us, when you think about what's higher, is it the visual sensation or the auditory sensation? It would be the auditory sensation in the pre-modern Islamic world. That's why calligraphy is very big, you know? And
But
so
what about architecture though? Because that's obviously been a big
which
feature
is
of what's emerged. Yeah.
right, and architecture, which is really interesting, is related closer to the natural world, right? So in the modern period, you have this again, this utilitarian kind of like how do we increase productivity, living spaces that are efficient, et cetera, et cetera. The pre-modern Islamic world, living spaces were, almost in a sense, at least like if you look at Muslim Spain and things like that, how do you emulate like Jannah? How do you emulate the natural world? Things like that. And again, that comes from being informed by the Quran, right? Because it's constantly pushing you, inna fi khalqis samawati wal ardi wa ikhtilafi layli wan nahar, like in the creation of the heavens and the earth and the alteration of night and day are signs for people to think, and so on. There's lots of ayat that are constantly pushing you to the natural world, and as such, an emulation of that which surrounds you is going to inform your architecture, you know. Um, but coming back to visual perception versus auditory perception,
Mm.
uh, that backdrop, that Christian backdrop, obviously informs the Enlightenment and continue, and it's still there, right? So when we think about how we perceive things, we give priority to ocular senses many times, right? And
Mm.
justifiably so, right? And I'm not saying like in the Quran, both senses are given, elevation. But
But what about music though? 'Cause that's massive, obviously.
sure,
Yeah, and we're still figuring out whether that's okay or not. But everyone else has moved on. So like,
right.
how does that feature into your thesis?
So I'm not dealing with music per
No,
se.
but just with the point about this kind of ocular versus auditory, because
Sure,
actually
sure. So
that might be a counterpoint to say, well, actually, a whole tradition
yes,
of music is there.
sure, sure. I mean, there were when you look at let's say institutes that were built to help people that were going to, let's say, mental health issues,
Yeah, yeah,
right?
it was a big
Not
thing.
even sure what music was actually a big part of that.
Yeah,
Now,
absolutely.
whether it's halal, haram, we put that
Mm,
discussion aside.
mm,
But people understood that, right?
yeah.
Even though, again, I would say that a lot of the priority was given to the Quran, the Adhan, and actually hearing these things in a natural setting, because all of that was taken, in its totality. Like if you compare like a modern mental health institute, the quintessential idea that comes in the mind is like this padded room, right? Which is very, it's very clinical and it's very just it doesn't seem like a place anyone would want to be. Whereas, if you compare that to mental health institutes, if that's what we want to call it, in the pre-modern Islamic world, a lot of that was how do you get people to re-engage with the natural world? So the space was given such that the windows would be open, you'd have, lush gardens and things like that because they understood that, when you're coming to now deal with someone's, let's say, psychological issues, even though that term wasn't used at the time, you have to take a holistic approach, everything down to like what they're eating, what's their diet like, how are they, how are they interacting with the adhan, for instance. And in some of those places, certain types of music therapy was used,
Yeah.
right? We're not going to try to brush history under the rug just because, we have a certain position on that. But it was, and it was engaged with. However, I would say that when we look at music in the modern world, that's a completely different dynamic, right? I mean, the
Oh,
type
sure.
of stuff that's produced nowadays, some people may even question whether that's even considered music in the first place.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, in terms of stuff that's popular, yeah. I
Yeah,
think in terms of but I think it goes back to maybe what the underlying point and what's at the heart of maybe what you're looking at, which is that all of this stuff at the end of the day is well, whatever is produced and
yeah,
wherever it's produced is just a reflection of where we are or what
yeah,
we are at the point in time, right? And so
absolutely.
it's a great reflection of just
And
as with everything else, the internal realities come out in all forms, and then
yep,
that's
yep.
just one of them. Yeah,
And I'll tell you the reason why I think that as I continue studying this area and writing about it, I think it's going to be more and more important as we move forward, right? Because
100%.
I wrote a small tract for Sapiens on doubts, right? And so how do you deal with shubuhat? And as I'm looking at like the AI revolution as it's coming, as I shouldn't say it's coming, it's here. Uh, I don't know if there'll be a passageway out to deal with the realities of artificial intelligence, except by engaging with the natural world and except by
100%.
engaging with the Quran.
I'm
Because
so
both
with you
of
on that.
those,
Yeah,
yeah,
100%.
because, and even it's in the word itself,
Yeah.
artificial intelligence versus natural, right? I
Yeah.
always tell people, I say, marketers know this very well,
Yeah.
right? They're trying to sell you something, they're going to send you all natural lotion, organic cereal, whatever it is. Like they know that because they know your internal fitra is connected to the natural world. And the more you disconnect, the more that gets disrupted, that's going to lead to just making it more and more difficult to connect with the divine. All the way down to, I don't know if I should open this door, and I don't know if you're
Yeah.
going to publish
Open,
this, but
open.
I'll
Once you've
open it.
said
All right.
that, we're breaking it down now, guys. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So,
go on. What were we going to say?
so what I was going to say is all the way down to when you think about language itself.
Mm,
Okay, so um, when you look at the English language, it's built upon phonemes. All right, now this is going to get a bit philosophical, but just stay with me, inshallah.
yeah,
So
yeah.
it's built upon phonemes. So phonemes
Mm,
are the smallest unit of sound.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
So phonemes, whether you're looking at English, whether you're looking at Greek, whatever you're looking at, these units of sound are meaningless. Okay. Now, the reason why, at least some researchers have said that the smallest unit of sound is meaningless, is because it actually goes back to Plato. So when Plato wanted to go against Homer, Homer was kind of the mythic storytelling backdrop, and Plato came with a kind of the more the rational philosophical backdrop, and so it was mythos versus logos, right? So Plato wanted to move away from mythos and move to logos. But one of the ways he does that is to say that our reality of things is in the abstract world. Okay, so his whole concept of the parable of the cave, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Um, where it's basically people that are looking at this image. There's a fire behind it. Everyone's just busy looking at these images on the wall of the cave. But the reality is, if they left the cave, that would be true reality, and that true reality is mathematical and abstract. Okay, so therefore, when it comes to, and that mathematical abstract reality is what we should be trying to get to, because that's how you leave the cave. And this goes down to even his concept of definitions. Platonic thought has had a lot of impact on how we even, how we study things. So we always start off with definitions a lot of times, especially in a lot of classical Islamic books. You say like, okay, start off with what are the definitions? But the interesting thing is, and this is true when you read a lot of the Socratic dialogue and things, when Socrates is always playing, telling, challenging people, tell me what is justice, tell me what is virtue, and he's making a fool out of people. But the thing is, why is that? Why does that happen? It's because what Plato was looking for was a type of abstract definition that is so precise that it models mathematical realities. So if I ask you, how would you define a triangle? Help me out here. How do you define a triangle?
A shape with three sides.
Any shape with three sides? Like I want a precise definition of a triangle.
A shape with exactly three sides.
Okay, I'll add a little bit to that.
Go on.
Shape with three straight lines that connect, whose angles add up to 180 degrees. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And every triangle fits that definition, and only triangles fit that definition. You with
Mm.
me?
Yeah.
Okay. Now you could do the same with a square, other geometric patterns, whatever. Where you have your definition says only X, right? And all X fit that definition. The problem is in our natural functioning of how language works, those mathematical realities are not transferred to human real life. Like if I ask you, give me a definition of a dog that only dogs fit into, and all dogs are categorized in that definition, you can't do
Yeah.
it,
Yeah.
right? It has ears and blah blah blah. Okay, so this abstraction that Plato talks about, he looks at kind of how language works, and he says, okay, when it comes to how language works, the smallest unit should be abstract because we're trying to get to that which is abstract, right? And so therefore, the smallest unit of sound is a phoneme. If you compare that to like the Arabic language, the smallest unit of sound isn't phonetic, or it's not based on a phoneme, it's what you call morphemic. In other words, even the smallest unit of sound has meaning. It's onomatopoeic. This is why when you learn tajweed, one of the first things that they try to teach you is makharij. The sound has meaning. And so how heavy and light and all those things when you're learning tajweed, why is that important? Is because when you are conveying something, sound is actually going to be a part of that, right? So a certain combination of letters, when you put it together, it's not only that it has a meaning, but because the letters themselves, the heaviness and lightness and sound and back and where it's coming from, all of that is meaning. And so therefore the meaning is enhanced because you not only get it by way of an intellectual process of this is what this word means, but even the sound reflects what this word means, right?
Yeah.
Um, and that's part and parcel of the Arabic language. And this is, and of course, the Quran makes use of this, right? There's a difference between, when you hear the term Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim, right? Rahman is the one that has like overwhelming mercy, like as if you're standing at the shores of an ocean and the waves are coming on and it's very heavy. It's a lot of it that's going on. Rahim, which is on the fa'il form, signifies like constant mercy. Like in every single situation, Muslim or non-Muslim, it doesn't matter. You are enjoying the mercy of God. Your ability to speak, all of that is so there's longevity, and that's reflected in the sound, right? So Ar-Rahman, it's very heavy. In other words, it's just a lot of overbearing mercy. Ar-Rahim, it's long, it's constant, right? So sound now becomes extremely important when it comes to language itself. So there's a difference now. We were talking about the influence of external factors. Even the language we speak is going to have an impact on how we perceive things,
100%.
and your paradigm is going to determine that. So, anyways, that was a long
No,
journey to where we were
no,
going
no,
with that.
very, very interesting. And so what then? What is a specific issue or question that you're addressing in the PhD?
Okay. So for that, there's a few things. So the official title of the PhD is called Islamic Pneumatology and the Phenomenology of Beauty. So to break that down, I already mentioned Islamic pneumatology, who or what is a human being. So I'm going to start off with let's make a working model from an Islamic worldview of who or what is a human being.
Yeah.
So I bring in Imam al-Ghazali's understanding of that, right? He has a section in his Ahya al-Madin called Ajaib al-Qalb, right? The wonders of the heart. And so he has a model of the human being. But what I found was that that's a good model, but what is missing is the concept of the fitrah. And someone that's written a lot on the fitrah is Ibn Taymiyyah. So I'm kind of taking both of their models and kind of combining them to work to bring a working model of who or what is a human being. So what do we mean by ruh? What do we mean by nafs? What is the fitrah? How is it combined in the heart? How does the aql like come to how does all that come together? Once you have a working model, now how does natural beauty impact us? Psycho, spiritually, cognitively, etc. And why natural beauty? So I make an I, there's a, so basically I'm looking at the effect of natural beauty on the human on the human being, the construct of the human being. That's essentially what I'm studying. But why natural beauty, right? Why not, just man-made beauty or like paintings and things like that? Because I have a certain thesis in this area. And my thesis is that when they say that beauty is subjective, right? Beauty lies in the eyes of the beholder, that is actually related to aesthetics, Western aesthetics, right? That therefore, like beauty is just it's a subjective. You really, it's just based
Yeah,
on
I mean, when you said that earlier, I mean, I didn't say anything then, but I knew you were just sort of making a point. But yeah,
yeah,
I'm like, well, no, what within a certain range, it might be subjective, but
right.
at some
You
point,
go- yeah.
ugly is ugly.
Yeah, and so the argument that I make is that yes, you could say that about things that have been put together by human beings, right? You can't say that when it comes to the natural world,
Mm,
right? And so like if you take it and there's a reason for that. Um, why is beauty subjective when it comes to works that are done by human beings, like a painting or a picture, photography? Well, it's subjective because you're looking at it from the vantage point of the painter, of the photographer, of the artist, whoever's doing that. So it is subject to that particular perception, that particular person's vantage point, right? But natural beauty, you're taking it directly. Like if you take I don't know if you've been to this part of the world. You know what the Niagara Falls is?
yeah, sure, I've been
Yeah,
there.
yeah, okay. So if you go to the Niagara, if you look at a painting of the Niagara Falls or a picture of the Niagara Falls, number one, it's not overwhelming in the sense that you're not taken by its entirety. You're looking at it in a frame, right? So you're limited by the frame. You're limited by the vantage point of the one that took the picture or the one that did the painting. Okay. So that's going to make it subjective just from the very onset. But if you were to go to the Niagara Falls, now there's no concept of it's not limited in any sort of sense. You take it in directly. And therefore, from that vantage point, you would say it's not subjective, it's objective because the natural world is not out to like put a trick on you, right? It's not like, haha, got you, right? It's just there. Whether you believe in God or not, it's irrelevant, right? It's just you can't say that, okay, my perception of this thing to be beautiful is going to be subject on my whatever, right? It's just you take it in directly. So what I'm saying is, in order for, or rather, coming back to my dissertation, in order for people to really understand the divine and the Islamic message, um, you know, uh, to be exposed to beauty actually enhances your ability to recognize the divine, right? And what I mean by that is natural beauty, not man-made beauty. Man-made beauty could do that, but it's not necessary. Whereas natural beauty, it's necessary, obviously, conditions related to the person, their disposition, etc. There's a whole bunch of things. That's why the working model of the soul or the working model of the human being becomes important. Because we see that what are those factors that become an impediment to someone experiencing that beauty and that leading them to God, if that makes
Yeah,
sense.
yeah.
So, so yeah, so that's
Is it necessarily the case that something which a human being makes, produces, which, let's say, which is agreed upon by a majority of others to be
sure.
beautiful,
Yeah,
is that is that whether that person knows it or not, is there something about them or something about that necessarily reflects divine beauty? I mean, what I'm trying to get at here is that essentially when a human being produces something that is beautiful,
yeah,
and to the extent that we, our output is, a some reflection of some name or attribute of God, either in its
sure,
fullness or in an obscured kind of fashion.
sure,
I mean, is that fair to say? Just like, for example, obviously, some make the argument that goodness or virtue,
mhm,
which is manifested by anybody, again,
sure,
regardless of their propositional affirmations about God or not,
sure,
is an act of faith almost, right?
sure.
Essentially, because
Right,
what
right.
else is it? Where else is
Yeah,
it
of
coming from?
course,
So,
of course.
do we say the same thing then here with regards to beauty or not?
So with regards to beauty, what I would say is that what I'm kind of trying to tackle, what I'm trying to tackle is the idea that all beauty is subjective. I'm saying if you're going to make the argument, you could make it with man-made beauty, right? And you
Yeah,
could, you could argue back and forth. And even if someone produced it, it could remind you of the divine.
mm.
It could be, in a sense, objective, right? Let's just, the problem with that is that, how do you show that it would be objective, right?
Yeah,
Like,
I get that case. Yeah,
yeah.
I understand that one. Yeah.
But does that mean that someone can't produce something that is beautiful, that everyone agrees is beautiful?
Mm,
Sure, they can.
mm,
Can it be something they've produced that reminds you of the divine? Absolutely, right? I mean, there's poetry that reminds you of the divine. There's, a khutbah that you go to, and just based on the power of the speaker, like how he's able to convey the message, the emotive strings he's able to pull, that will remind you of the divine, which in fact you're supposed to do, right? It's interesting, Dr. Sarar Ahmad, he says that when you go to the Quran, it's in fact a collection of divine orations. He goes
mm,
to look at it as a text is actually a faux pas. It's a
mm,
mistake.
mm.
But if you see it as, okay, this is now because an orator, like they understand rhetorical devices, they understand certain concepts, right? Like if you're at a great khutbah, and the guy's gonna, he may invoke certain things that if you just find it in a book, you'd find it very strange, right? So if someone's talking about, let's say, I don't know, inflated petrol prices, right? And he wants to talk about the economy or whatever, and and everyone kind of has that backdrop already, right? They're experiencing high petrol prices, and so now he starts talking about it. He says, "Look, these prices, they're terrible." And then he just kind of shifts focus and says, "Mr. President, do you not see that these prices have been elevated and so on and so forth?" The president is not in the masjid in the khutbah, but the fact that he's referred to it, it's type of rhetorical device, and therefore, like you'll see that in the Quran by way of iltifat, grammatical shifts and things like that, which at least in the past, when Orientalists would come to the Quran, they would find it very difficult. Like, it's like, what is this?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But anyways, this was going to come back to what you were saying. Someone could produce something that reminds you of the divine, right? And that's fine. I'm not saying that, if it's man-made, it's automatically
Mm. Yeah,
not
yeah.
biblical, or it has to be debated or something like that. Again, what I'm trying to say is, going back to kind of subjective versus objective, I don't think, when it comes to the natural world, that you could say that yes, that is subjective.
No, sure. Where I was going with my question was a little bit because one related issue that I've been thinking about is this whole thing, around uh, the weight of goodness or
Sure.
virtue, the,
Yeah.
the weight that virtue carries with God
Yeah.
from someone who, let's put it this way, maybe doesn't clearly fit into any or clearly or explicitly fit into any Quranic category. Yeah, because I think
Sure.
we have this kind of issue now that the Quranic categories, again, I mean, I know this is a different subject, but I think feel it relates in a way, which is to say that, and it kind of does relate to what we were speaking right about at the beginning about the humanizing, and as opposed to starting off with you're a non-Muslim, you're not me, and then let's go start from there. Which,
Right.
so something around, it's something around what is the weight, or the weight and the meaning and the value of goodness and virtue, uh, which, let's put it this way, somebody who hasn't necessarily propositionally affirmed, the oneness of God, like in a
Sure.
shared setting and
Yep.
everything, they're
Yep.
also not someone who has engaged in, let's say, active, rejection and disbelief. They're
Sure.
not a hardcore atheist, materialist, physicalist, whatever, right?
Right. Right.
They're in that, sea of people, sort of somewhere in the middle,
Yep.
essentially, and yeah, maybe have a notion of a loose notion of God, maybe the kind of, the kind of person who might not be able to give you an equivalent of, let's call it sort of ikhlas theology, but if you were
Sure.
to say it to them, say, what do you think about that? So yeah, that sounds that's
Yeah, that
probably
sounds
where
about
I'm at.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So me, I kind of feel, I don't know. So it's a separate kind of thing I'm thinking about, which is, is it possible actually that
Uh-huh.
there are, as far as God is concerned, believers out there, that
Yeah.
we don't call Muslim, because we have this neat boxes of, Muslim, non-Muslim, by virtue of this propositional statement and everything else. But it
Right.
was, again, just to say something around, but so I've been thinking about that question, and that's why I was just thinking about this other question, which is to
Sure.
say, with, because I think, well, to put it in typical speak, right? Um, in some senses, there's a puzzle in the fact that how can how come it is the case that non-Muslims can be good and do good? How come it is the case that non-Muslims can kind of produce works of beauty, right? Essentially,
Sure.
right?
Right.
Because if those things are reflection that, and if that's not just from them, independent of God, obviously, and it's in somehow, but then so we must be saying in somehow, again, whether they're making that mental link or not, they're somehow reflecting you know, or 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 uh, or,
100%.
or are channels for
Yeah. Yeah.
divine a good well, the virtue and beauty kind of flowing, these qualities kind of flowing through them, which then if we understand, then I think adds to that previous thing we were discussing about how we now see a person almost, you know.
Look, so remember I was talking about who or what is a human being.
Yeah, yeah,
We start off with this concept, like I talked to that lady. Our assumption is that you're starting off from a position of goodness. The
yeah, yeah.
fitra is part of every human being.
All right, exactly,
Kullu
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
mawludin yuladu ala fitra. Every child is
Mm,
born upon the fitra.
mm.
And so naturally, if the base state of people is good, right, then
Mm.
therefore things that they can produce, let's
Yeah,
say
it's not a surprise. It's not a surprise.
not a
Yeah,
surprise, not at
yeah,
all,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
And if
Yeah,
they produce works of beauty,
mm,
that's not a surprise either, right? Because
yeah,
the other aspect is so, yes, there are certain things that are part of the fitra. One of those things that's part of the fitra is your recognition of beauty,
mm,
right? Uh, these aren't like beauty is not something like that you try to prove, right? It's not a rational argument.
yeah, 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 yeah. Of
Like if
course.
I see a beautiful sunset and and I'm like I'm there with my wife and I say, "Wow, that's beautiful," and she says, "Honey, that is the ugliest thing I've ever seen." Prove to me rationally, it's not a rational question, right? It's something
Yeah,
that you're just kind of directly experiencing.
yeah.
Now, what is it that experiences that? What is that recognition? Where does it come from? If it's not a rational process, well, it comes from the fitrah.
Mm,
You know?
yeah,
Even
absolutely.
rational processes come from the fitrah. If you boil it down,
Yeah.
because then you have to ask questions, things like axioms, first principles, and basic beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
Even Taymiyyah mentioned that those are part of the fitrah. You
Yeah,
can't prove an axiom,
yeah,
but they exist somewhere,
yeah,
right? And that's
yeah,
part of your original normative disposition, your fitrah, right?
yeah.
So it's not a surprise that okay, well, people who let's say haven't affirmed God in this kind of this or let's say who are not based on the Sharia legally Muslims, right? Because I think sometimes we conflate the idea of like Iman and Islam in the sense that Islam is a legal category at the end of the day,
Mm,
right?
mm,
At the same time, we cannot like it is not theologically, we are not supposed to say, you, John, are going to the hellfire. Like you, I'm going to take you out as an individual. It's
mm.
not even permitted.
No, sure, sure, yeah. It typically
You
doesn't
can't.
go to that level, but there's something about our collective consciousness, I feel, that is reflective of that kind of attitude. Like
Yeah,
we're
I
not
mean,
saying it, we're not it's not saying that, but
right.
it's kind of like to hell with them sort of thing, right? That way.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of that it has to do with the centrality of Islamic law within our lives,
Mm,
right?
mm,
So if you think about Islam, I know this is going to go off on another tangent. If you think about Islam as a political system, okay?
mm,
Now, researchers have asked, well, what is it? Is it a theocracy? Is it a democracy? Does it have, and I think one of the interesting aspects someone said is that it's nomocratic and nomocentric, meaning the law, nomos, is central to it. Like if you don't have the law, you really don't have governance when it comes to Islam, right? Because no matter how powerful a khalifa can get, they still have to abide by the Sharia in a certain sense, or at least qualify what they're doing with reference to an external law that they're not implementing, if that makes sense. So it's nomocratic and nomocentric. Now, 14, well, I shouldn't say 14, like, over 1,000 years of having this sort of understanding of the law takes precedence, it's going to shape how we understand things, right? So the
mm,
legal definition of a Muslim is someone that takes their shahada, they've entered Islam, da 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 da. Now, is that the reality of people that we engage with? To superimpose a legal definition on the reality of every human being, you're going to run into some cognitive dissonance there. Because, like you said, you're going to run into people that are very good. That the character would just blow your mind, right? Maybe better than the guy that's chopping your halal meat or whatever, right? And so their character will be impressive. Their
mm,
output may be very beautiful in terms of their poetry or their whatever it might be, and yet they're not legally classified as a Muslim, right?
mm, mm,
We would say yet. Anyway, so but and so and this is why, when it comes to the question of what happens to people like that when they die, right? Because this is a question you get. Like, okay, so they like, are they Muslim? Are they not Muslim? Like, what's their status at the end?
I don't get why we're all good with just postponing that one.
Well, yeah, I mean, postponing it and understanding that it's not our job.
Well, exactly. That's what I mean. Yeah, that's what
I
I mean.
mean, we're not responsible. We're responsible for telling them like, look, man, you're producing all this beautiful work. You've got this, great character. You'd make a great Muslim, man, or whatever, right? Like just tell them about Allah, and then after that, But it's interesting that, like for instance, there's a hadith in the Muslim Imam Ahmad where the Prophet ﷺ says that a few categories of people will show up on the Day of Judgment. I'm not sure if you've heard this narration, but it's a Sahih narration. And amongst them are people that were deaf, they couldn't hear, mentally deficient, right? They had certain mental problems, and people that came in between the prophets, meaning they never directly heard the message, right?
Mm,
So the Prophet ﷺ mentioned that these categories of people will come, and on the day of judgment, Allah will send them a messenger, and that messenger will tell them, "Follow me." Okay, so the people that follow him, and he will walk into fire. So the people that follow him, now mind you, these people are seeing the day of judgment. They've seen the mountains crumble, the seas are on fire, the child comes out of his grave with his head turned, hair turned gray. They see all of that. So a messenger will be sent to them, telling them like, follow me. He'll walk into fire. The people that follow him will find that the fire doesn't burn them, and they've passed the test. As to the other people, they won't, right? In essence, what we're going back to is Allah is al-adl. He's maximally perfect in his justice. So whether they fit a certain legal category in this dunya, it's not reflective of the absolute justice or the perfection of Allah's justice on the day of judgment.
mm,
That being the case, we always start off with an assumption that people are born on the fitrah.
yeah,
They are good at their core, and their environment and a whole bunch of other things is what shapes them. Just like, and that's not only non-Muslims, that's Muslims too. Like our
mm.
environment has an impact on us. Like I mentioned earlier,
Of course.
it has a cognitive impact on us, just the living spaces that we're in.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So,
Yeah. No,
but
great.
yeah.
I really appreciated the conversation, and I'm conscious I've taken up a lot of your time. I think the work you're doing is really super valuable, and yeah, can't wait for. I don't know if you've been speaking much about it as you've been doing it, or if you're kind of waiting to kind of get to it and then sort of start and
No,
then
I've
maybe
I've
getting
I've
up.
done a presentation, kind of alluding to it. It's called "Beauty and the Recognition of God." There's a
Okay,
few recordings on
nice,
YouTube if you're
nice,
interested.
nice.
It's out there. And then some of the other work that we're doing is Sapience on artificial intelligence.
Okay, yeah,
Because
yeah.
I do think that,
Well,
as we get
it's
into,
massive, yeah,
yeah, I mean, as we get into this world of artificial technology or
yeah,
just artificial intelligence, we're really going to see kind of a shift away from the divine. And that's not only because of,
yeah.
let's say, intellectual doubts, right? So certain doubts that arise, you're kind of expecting that. Like, okay, so if we're able to create artificial intelligence and you get to a position of super intelligence, are those beings conscious? Okay. Now that's a question. I don't really think that's a difficult question. I think where the difficulty will arise is the experience of artificial intelligence, because
Mm,
that has an impact on any technology has an impact on your internal state. Like I'll give you an example. We'll take an example of a very rudimentary type of technology, and that would be something like a map. Okay.
mm,
When you think about where you are, your spatial reality, okay, before the advent of maps, it would be very organic. You are where you are. You meet people. You go down the street. When you need to take directions, you have this idea of where you are. Okay. Yes, it's limited because it's only where you physically reach. Now, in order to extend that understanding of where you are, you had the advent of maps. Okay. Now, what
mm,
maps do is that they basically they're analogical space. They represent space. The problem is that the you are basically taking what the cartographer did and assuming that that is real,
mm,
right? So like the quintessential example of this, when you look at a globe, and like you're in a classroom or whatever it is, you could be in Islamic school or non-Islamic school, it doesn't matter. The globe is always going to show North America on top, South America on the bottom, Europe on top, Africa on the bottom, and Australia on the bottom, and so right. And you have to ask, well, you don't have to ask, but I'll ask, like, is that is that objective? Like, if you went to outer space, would that be objectively true that North America's on top And the answer is no, because there is no kind of up, down, right. I mean, there's nothing, right? So cardinal direction and and the position on the map, whether it's up or down, uh, we may think, okay, this is not a big deal, right? In fact, if you look at the 12th century cartographer out of Muslim Spain, Muhammad al-Idrisi, he actually drew the map the other way around, right?
Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so in his map, you had Europe on the bottom and you had kind of Africa on top and Mecca at the center. And obviously, these things are informed by a person's worldview, right? The map we use today is Ptolemy's map. Ptolemy obviously was not a Muslim, was not influenced by Islam, and so for him, Europe was dominant, right? So therefore, that goes on top. For Muhammad al-Idrisi, no, like the majority of the Muslim lands are dominant, so that goes on top. Now, does this have an impact on reality? There were studies that were shown that when they looked at moving companies and how they would price items, right? How they would price their services for moving, and what they found is that they would on average, here in the US, they would price moving from south to north $250 more than going from north to south. Okay. Now these are just based on cardinal directions, but why? Not because of some sort of objective, like it's harder to go from south to north, because in our perception, when we think we're going up, it's like we're going up a hill. Going south to north, it's like you're moving up. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Based on that perception, they'll actually charge you more. These are studies that were done. I actually quote them in my presentation, but it has an impact on where you think you are. So a map, it has an impact on where you think you are, whether it's right or wrong. It may not objectively correct or incorrect, right? But it is analogical space. It's taking, the reality of space, shrinking it, giving you an analogy, and allowing you to shrink it and have an idea. So it's a rudimentary technology. It's a good technology. It allows you to go from point A to point B or whatever it might be, but it still has an impact on where you think you are, and whether it's accurate or not is, we don't know, right? It could be, it
Sure,
could
sure.
not be, right?
Yeah.
Now you add to that, let's say Google Maps. So now it's not only having an
Hmm.
impact on where you think you are, now it's also dictating where you should go, right? When it says make a left, make a right, you're like sami'na wa ta'na, and here we obey, and we're going to basically take it where we want. Now, if that is a map and that has an impact on where you think you are, how much more so when it comes to artificial intelligence, where you have an app now that, sorry about that,
I'm
when
sorry.
whereas now you have technology where they're developing an app that that you can call, or you can have a conversation with a dead relative, someone that's passed away. Why?
Mm-hmm.
Because they need 3 seconds of the person's voice to construct an entire conversation. They can curate all the data that's on this person's Instagram, Facebook,
Yeah.
TikTok, whatever it is, including things like their medical records and all sorts of other things. And you pick up the phone, you're hearing, let's say your mother passed away, in her voice, talking about, do you remember when you were 5 and I took you to so and what sort of a psychological, emotive impact is that going to have on the human being? And what sort of doubts is that going to, that's going to have a major impact, right? Let alone when you talk about kind of how the emotions will be impacted by, when these things are put into robots and things like that. I mean, that's right around the corner. Um, so that's going to have an immense amount of impact. So the doubts that we're talking about when it comes to artificial intelligence are not the doubts of yesterday, where it's like, okay, how do you rationally understand this? These are phenomenological doubts. And
Mm.
so they're going to require a phenomenological response,
Yeah, but more all encompassing, essentially.
more
I,
encompassing.
I remember I remember I remember having that thought. I mean, even before, obviously related to that whole AI thing, but I
Yeah,
just remember I was very depressed for 2 3 days after like I think it was a couple of years back, whatever, the first time Meta
yeah,
sort of they'll
yeah,
launch the
yeah.
goggles, yeah, and I
Yep.
thought this is the beginning of the end.
You
Yeah,
see it?
like I don't care what anyone says, because everyone says yeah, human beings adapt to the technological thing and the next thing, but it's like when you are going to put something over your eyes,
Yeah.
right, and you're going to just enter this whole other realm, then it's just yeah.
All of these things have a phenomenological impact.
Yeah,
right?
100%.
And this is why I'm arguing that in order to go against that, you have to interact with the natural world.
Yeah.
And you have to interact with the Quran as well, because that is kalam
Yeah.
Allah. And so,
And I think the powerful thing about this message um is that this is something which everybody gets, actually. Everybody knows this, you know?
yeah,
Like
I'm not,
meaning it's a
I
very
always tell,
as a message, it's a very
yeah,
universal message, right? It's just like let's just go out into the woods, go into the forest, get into the hill, just actually have a conversation, whatever. You know what I mean?
of
And just
course,
just the process
100%.
itself. Yeah.
I'll tell people, I'm like, look, man, if let's say I presented a study to you, which there was a study done at MIT where they clearly showed that excessive use of ChatGPT causes cognitive degeneration. Okay.
Yeah.
But you don't need a study to know that. Like,
Yeah.
it's not like mind blowing, like, oh, really? Are you sure? Any sort of technology, and this is, technologies are gonna have benefits. They're most definitely gonna have costs. Had that even writing, like when you think about, printing, the Gutenberg printing press, when that comes to the scene, a lot of people like to knock, um, let's say, ulama, scholars of the past, that said, hold on a second, we shouldn't be jumping into this, and we should look at these people. Had it not been for them, we'd be just like the West, and we would have been rich and
Mhm.
whatever, blah blah blah. But I say, you know what? I think we're not doing husn al-dhan. We're not giving them the benefit of the doubt when it comes to their fatwa related to these technologies. Because why? What did the Gutenberg printing press do? There's a phenomenological reality. For instance, when it comes to who decides what to print,
Mm.
right? That you've given that control to somebody else now. And so what they print, let's say in the Arabic domain, they can't print everything, right? That's extant. Those things are in manuscript form. What they choose to print is what gets commonplace, and that's going
Yeah.
to have an impact on what you're reading, you know? Whereas when you come to a world that doesn't have the Gutenberg printing press and that you're relying upon your own memorization and your own kind of interaction with the Quran directly,
Mm.
and you're reading a lot, let's say a lot less. I know this might sound, blasphemous to many people, reading less, but you're spending more time with the Quran and its memorization and its phenomenological impact it has on you. That's going to impact you in a way that in the past you could have things like polymaths, right? Because how they interacted with knowledge was very different than what happens after the advent of the Gutenberg printing press, right? Because now you have so much information that's now printed, um, that now how you engage with knowledge has to be, um, narrow and deep, as opposed to being a little more shallow and more broad.
Yeah.
So I say that the age of the polymath is gone, right? The Ibn Taymiyyahs and the Imam al-Ghazalis. I mean, these are people that produce volumes of work. Nowadays, the best, let's say, professor can produce maybe 3, 4 books that are, that he can do at best. Maybe if you want to go a bit further back, other academics have produced more, but nowhere near the voluminous output that you get from the people of the past. Now, you have to ask why, right? So technology, whatever form it is, and I'm not trying to be a Luddite and say, okay, now go and set the whatever, the places where the servers are housed, go set them on fire. So that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying at least as as a Muslim, we should be somewhat cautious not to just jump into, artificial intelligence. Yes,
No, you're
we
right.
should
Yeah.
use it, but let's just put the brakes on for a second and understand that this is going to have real ramifications on, our connection with the divine. So,
Yeah, no, absolutely, absolutely. I think what you said definitely resonates with me. I am skeptical though, as to whether uh you know whether the ability to if it is the case, as with seemingly less um or seemingly more innocent kind of forms of technology which have become commonplace today,
you know,
ultimately uh a person's ability to socially and economically function at all, right,
of
is going
course,
to depend on a high degree of interaction with multiple forms of artificial intelligence. And therefore, even though there are still insulating kind of, activities and defense mechanisms that one can have in place,
Yeah.
it's that I feel that there is I have a lot of respect for the Luddite head for the hills. I think I told somebody in a recent podcast, like I've just started respecting the Amish all of a sudden. Yeah, like bro, these guys, they got it, they get it. They were all of a
Everyone
sudden
else
like,
was mocking them, and we're
yeah,
like, you know what? Maybe
yeah,
they're onto
all of
something.
a sudden, look, like it's like you were saying about scholars of the past who were just like,
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about this. All of a
Right.
sudden, these guys to me look like the wisest, wisest
Yeah.
bunch. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I think, yeah, it is. I mean, there's so many threats, which are uh, posed by
Yeah,
all
and,
that. Yeah.
I'm not someone that likes to have like a very pessimistic view of the future and we're all doom and
No,
gloom.
neither do I generally, but I think in this case, the problem is, right, it's like the concentration of it's the level, it's now the level of power, the
Yeah.
concentration of that power, and the ability to have like uh, I mean, once upon a time, and not so long ago, like it would take, these things would ripple around, okay, and would take
Oh no.
a damn
Now
heck of a long time. Now it's just like things are going to be so instantaneous that you combine kind of nuclear with AI with all the various military,
all
this and
sorts
that,
of things.
whatever.
Yeah.
I think unfortunately uh I think it's to act optimistically, but at least to probably maintain a realistic
Yeah, I mean,
you know,
just be cautious with this sort of
yeah,
thing.
yeah,
I think it was last Ramadan, I had mentioned to, to our, when I'd be giving khutbahs and stuff, and I'd be telling people like, look, man, I know you're fasting and that's great, but consider a digital fast as well.
oh yeah, 100%,
I mean,
definitely,
that's just, I'm not trying to do a bid'ah or something like that. I'm just saying that,
yeah,
like, just to disconnect, man, and when you come to the masjid, leave your phone in the car, leave your Apple Watch in the car, right? I mean, you got so many technology. I mean, you've got
yeah.
the Meta glasses, leave them in the car too, right? So
Uh,
just leave that stuff in the car and just see how you feel,
no, over the
just
last year, just to say on a personal note, on the last year, I've been like much more consciously like going on hikes, spending time in nature,
great.
just
That's
a lot
great.
more, and definitely like it's been massive for me personally, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been doing that because, everyone that knows me knows I'm very insular, which is very ironic because like my wife was like, "You're like the last person that should be writing about beauty and nature and stuff. You hate going out in nature." I'm like, "Yeah, because it's annoying and mosquitoes and all sorts of other things, you know." But I was like, just because, that's my own issue, I still do think that people should engage with the natural world. And even for myself, like yeah, I'm not going out on deep hikes and things like that, but when I'm kind of leaving my house, I mean, the good thing about living in Texas is that you get to see the night sky and it's clear. Like the moon. This morning, I was dropping my kids off to school, and it was past Fajr. It was daylight, and yet the moon was clear. It was clear, right? And I called my kids out, and I was like, just take a look, and they're just in awe, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah,
So
nothing like the full moon for sure.
yeah,
Listen, I think it would be nice to finish just to bring back some of the stuff you were saying earlier, because when you talk about
sure.
all the color stuff, couple of my favorite verses sort of came to mind,
Okay,
and you'll be very familiar with them. But I'll just maybe just read. Well, I'll read them in Arabic and in translation, and then you can just maybe close off with your just maybe
sure,
reflections on it.
sure.
So this is chapter 35, Surah Fatir, verses 27 and 28.
Okay.
So in the Arabic, ألم تر أن الله أنزل من السماء ماء فأخرجنا به ثمرات مختلفا ألوانها.
Mhm.
Have you not considered how God sends water down from the sky and that we produce with it fruits of varied colors? ومن
Yeah,
الجبال جدد بيض وحمر مختلف ألوانها وغرابيب سود. That there are in the mountains layers of white and red of various colors and jet black.
yeah,
ومن الناس والدواب والأنعام مختلف ألوانه كذلك. That there are various colors amongst human beings, wild animals, and livestock too. إنما يخشى الله من عباده العلماء. It is those of his servants of knowledge who stand in true awe of God. إن الله عزيز غفور. God is almighty, most forgiving. And I think I'm probably not wrong in saying that's probably the highest concentration of alwan, the
yeah.
colors, being mentioned in the
I
Quran.
believe so. I believe
And
so.
what I find fascinating about this is the fact that just that phrase, that commonly used phrase about it is the ulama, those of knowledge who stand in true awe of God.
Right.
Actually, if you look at the context of where that's nested, like in these verses, all of a
Yep.
sudden, what is knowledge
Yeah.
and where is all coming from? And it just relates to everything. So maybe just offer some thoughts on just on this.
Yeah. So it's interesting that when we speak about there were some studies done on the phenomenon of awe, AWE, right? When you
Mm-hmm.
think about khushu'a,
Mm.
first of all, what is awe? right? Like if it's very difficult to kind of give a definition of a particular definition, but it's
Just
that
sorry,
feeling.
are you thinking of khushu or khashya? Because these are and here
These are two
yakhsha.
different things.
Yeah,
I
yeah,
get
yeah,
that, right?
yeah.
But so khashya would probably
Mm,
be,
mm, mm, mm.
but the concept of awe, that
Yes, yes,
state
yes, yes.
where
Yeah,
you are in your external circumstances are like overwhelming.
yeah, yeah.
And this happens like when you're at the base of a massive waterfall, like the
Mm,
feeling of smallness, right?
yeah,
And a type of fear that is not like khawf per se, right?
no,
But it's more like not like, oh, I'm scared that someone's coming to kill me, but it's just like this type of fear. It's almost difficult to describe, but you get what I'm saying. It is a type of fear that you're standing at a waterfall, you just feel small, and that feeling, notice that it's the ulama. Like, what is true knowledge, like you mentioned,
mm,
right? Some mufassirin said that it's this verse is as if Allah was saying the only people entering paradise will be the ulama, right? People of knowledge, right? Because he goes, innama yakhsha Allah min ibadihi, right? So the innama is for exclusivity. But anyway, but it's interesting that when you go through the Quran, and this is just general, what you'll find is that there's always this link between spirituality and rationality, right? These verses, I mean, that kind of reflect that. Why? Because that sort of engaging with the natural world is a type of spiritual experience. It's a phenomenological experience that informs like your knowledge, like the fact that you know. So
mm.
knowledge is not to be relegated to this, like a type of proposition.
As you've
It
been
has to
saying,
do with experience,
yeah,
Um, so yeah, so I mean that's I guess what I would say about that.
yeah,
When you have uh that that awe that you're standing before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but you experience that type of awe in the natural world as well, you
mm,
know.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So
I heard the explanation that khashya is like this kind of like as you said, a type of fear, but where knowledge is involved, like you know what you're in front of. Whereas khawf
yeah,
might be to a certain extent, at least an aspect of that might be fear of the unknown, or there's like a threat maybe, but it's kind of
yep,
maybe a bit
yep,
more uncertain. Whereas you're in front of
yep.
the mountain or waterfall, like you said, you know what's hitting you,
Yeah,
right?
you're
Yeah,
you're experiencing it,
yeah, yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah.
this goes back to kind of the idea of experiential knowledge itself, right? So, so for instance, we know that yaqeen, certainty,
Mm,
in English, when we talk about yaqeen or we talk about certainty, we generally it's almost like a binary. You're either certain or you're not certain, right? You're certain
mm-hmm.
or doubtful. In the Islamic context, there's levels of certainty, right?
100%. Yeah.
There's ilmul yaqeen or ainul yaqeen, ilmul
Mm-hmm.
yaqeen, or ilmul yaqeen, ainul yaqeen, and haqqul yaqeen. That highest level is by way of experience.
Mm,
I tell people, if I'm having a headache, you could, and you wanted to prove to me that I'm not, you could put me down on an fMRI machine, show me all the neurological functionings in my mind, and try to prove it's irrelevant. You give me all the evidence in the world, all the logical arguments, but if I'm experiencing it, it doesn't matter, right?
yeah.
So experiential knowledge, and this is something that Imam al-Ghazali spoke a lot about, and and ayat like this kind of highlight that, right? Like your
Yeah.
engagement with the natural world is experiential. And really, when it comes to like knowing Allah by way of his ayat, that's a completely different dynamic than knowing Allah by way of some sort of argument, you know.
Yeah. 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 Statements. Yeah.
Circle.
Absolutely. No,
Yeah.
awesome. It's really, really good. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much. When you completing the PhD?
Soon.
I know that's actually not a good question to ask anyone who's doing a PhD. Yeah, yeah. Sorry.
So
Sorry.
I'm trying to wrap it up soon. So I'm
Okay, cool,
hoping
cool.
that within the next few months,
Nice, nice.
six
Yeah.
months,
Uh,
but hopefully sooner than that.
does
Uh,
Hamza say to you, "Oh, I've got it done"? Yeah, he
no,
celebrates.
no, no, he's not. No, no, because I started after him, so he's, he
Fair,
didn't really say
fair
that.
enough. Fair enough. Fair
And we
enough.
started at the same time. Then yeah, I'd feel really bad. But I started after him, and a lot of things with a PhD, it's not always in your control per se,
Mm, mm,
right? Because you have to wait for a committee to get together
of
and
course.
this that, and so
Yeah, yeah.
so the writing part of it, I hope to finish within a few next 3-4 months because the research side has been done.
Mm,
But now, when does the actual committee come together, review
sure,
it?
sure, sure.
It has to go
Yeah,
through my supervisor first, so it's
yeah.
a few steps before that,
Few
inshallah.
steps. Yeah, cool. Well,
Yeah.
awesome. Thank you so much. I'll stop the recording and then
All right,
yeah, if you remember that was happening.
yeah.